Stanford University.
I have to say I felt a little worried about coming today because I just came 10 minutes ago from a discussion section. And the book was Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, one of my favorite novels. And the day that I won the award, the Dean's Teaching Award, which won me a slot in the series, I had a discussion section on that novel, and it was the worst discussion section I've ever had in my entire life. So when they gave me the award, I thought, oh God, you know, all I could think of was what a bad teacher I had been that day. So I was a little nervous about the coincidence. The other part of that being that I'm particularly nervous about being televised. I'm not a televised type of person. And my absolute fear is, as I wrote to the person who's doing the video, is that I'll be at the bookstore cafe getting a cup of coffee, and I'll look up and see that television set with my face on it, and I said, the horror, the horror. That was the email. So somehow it all came together today with Joseph Conrad, and I actually had a fantastic discussion section. So I might be referring back to some of the things that I think worked. I'm going to start first by some general remarks, and then about teaching and about the Stanford student, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the discussion section in general. The first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about my own history as a teacher and how I learned to teach, because I think it's instructive in itself. And my real feeling that teaching is really hard to teach. I can sit up here and give you some pointers, but I actually think teaching is an art. It's a real craft. And like all crafts and arts, we can't learn about it in lecture halls. We can't, you can learn some principles and some tips, but actually it's one of those things you learn by doing and by experience. So in some ways, what I'm going to do is going to give you some guidelines today, but I think the only way to really learn about teaching is to teach and to take risks teaching, trying new things. So that's the limits of what I think I can teach you today. I learned to teach at a high school where I went. I went to a Quaker high school, and I got the job by accident, actually, sort of floating around in life, and they offered me a job, so I took it. And I taught high school for 4 years. And I had the somewhat interesting and I think wonderful experience of being taught by teachers who had taught me in the classroom. And the hardest thing about it, of course, was calling them by their first names. Mrs. Barrows was always going to be Mrs. Barrows, my math teacher. And the wonderful thing about teaching at this school was that as a Quaker school, the philosophy of teaching was that all students had an inner light, which is the Quaker philosophy of human dignity and human worth. And the idea of teaching in a Quaker school is to speak to that inner light, to find out what really special and unique quality each individual in your classroom has, and to teach to that particular quality. And so the task of teaching is both to find that, to locate it, to discover it in your students, and then to try and bring it out as much as possible. Now, we used to have a saying in the faculty room that some lights were brighter than others, and that's certainly true. However, that struck me as a wonderful philosophy, and I've really carried it with me, and I'll try and show you today how I use that in a discussion section. Because, in fact, there's an adage about college versus high school teaching, which is that if you teach in high school, you teach the person, but if you teach in college, you teach the subject. And I actually try to undermine that distinction in any way I can, because I don't think you can just teach the subject. We all know that students learn and not learn for a variety of reasons. The whole person gets involved here. It's not just a brain. It's not just a logical process learning. It's an emotional one. It has to do with a student's self-confidence, their sense of worth, all those things. So the more you teach the whole person, I think, the better results you'll get. I also want to say some things about Stanford students, because we're here to teach Stanford students, and they're very unique in their own ways. And having taught high school, at high school I basically taught high to low. Everyone had their, brilliant students, and everyone had their not so brilliant students. And of course, that was a challenge to teach the not so brilliant students. I remember I used to smoke then, and after that not so brilliant class, I'd come in, take a big drag. So, but here we teach the brightest. We teach the brightest. The first time I came to Stanford, I was amazed by how bright these students were. I was just floored, to be honest. And I couldn't believe I was going to get paid to teach them. They're so easy to teach because they get things so quickly, they're so interested. They also do all the reading, which a lot of students, a lot of other places don't do. The challenge with Stanford students, I think, is that learning for them is just one slot in their day. They have their public service, and they have their athletics, and they have their other extracurricular activities, and they don't think about books as part of their life. In other words, they're students but not intellectuals. That's the challenge for me, to make them really think about ideas as part of their life. They'll do things, they'll complete the task, but I'm not sure how much they think about what they're learning when they're learning it. One of the ways I used to put it is, I used to teach at Brown as a TA before I came here, and at Brown students are extremely intellectually involved in their work, but they don't do the reading. So I used to say, well, you assign 300 pages of Nietzsche to a Brown student, and they come in and they've only read 100 because they're so depressed. They can't read the rest. But if you assign 300 pages of Nietzsche to a Stanford student, they come in and they've read all 300 pages and they're not depressed at all. And I think that really is the challenge, is to get them to get depressed. So anyways, that's what I think is, again, extremely bright. And I have to say, I walk out of this discussion section every week. It's a group of very bright freshmen. It's a Civ History 3 class, and there's nothing like that high you get, the incredible high you get when you walk out of a discussion section when they've taught you something about a novel I've read at least 8 times. So in general, I think we are in a really lucky place in doing a job which is amazing that we get paid to do. Okay, so given all that, let's talk about a discussion section. And I think actually this is where the real learning happens more and more. I think students are getting to a point now where sitting in lectures is a good experience for them, but I think that the kinds of background they've had, the experience growing up, it's really what happens in that discussion section where it all happens. I sometimes feel as a lecturer like I'm an MTV video. I don't know if anyone else feels that way. And they just want to channel surf in some way. But I do feel like I'm effective with them in the classroom. So the first thing you need to do to get a good discussion, crucial, is the first day. The first day is crucial. It's not a day you want to slough off. You've really established a lot of things the first day, and so it's a day to really think incredibly carefully about what you're going to do. The first thing you need to do is set up the atmosphere. And this is actually pretty easy for me to do, and be honest, given what I just told you. But when I started this section 4 weeks ago, the first thing I said to them was, I woke up this morning and I was walking my dog in the park, and I thought, I'm going to meet 15 new Stanford students today. And I am really excited about that. And if you give them that kind of sense, that's wonderful towards setting up a good, fruitful discussion section. So try and be as positive as possible. Tell them what your personal investment is in this classroom. And I think that will make a difference in terms of setting up an atmosphere in which everyone feels good about being there. Now, Civ, as you know, is a required course. So it's particularly important for them to know that you're excited about teaching in a required course, because they might not be excited about learning. So your excitement has to somehow compensate for that. Second thing you want to do, the first class, is make the students as comfortable as possible. And what my goal in a discussion section is to get the students to be talking to each other as if they were having an incredibly good discussion in the dorm that we know will never happen. They'll sit around in the dorm and talk about The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. That will never happen, but you can reproduce the feeling of comfort, of talking to one another, and of really talking without trying to impress the teacher. I think you can do that in the classroom, and that's what I set out to do. I try to make them comfortable. First of all, most important thing is to learn their names. You know, that's the most important thing, that first class, is you have to walk out of there knowing every single one of their names. And I am incredibly bad about names. I really am. It's not my forte at all. But I think it goes back to this notion about that inner light. First thing every student wants to know is that you know who they are. And that has got to happen in the first 2 hours of your relationship. And it does. The first step of it is really knowing their name and really taking care to pronounce their name correctly. And sometimes that's a challenge, but you really have to work at it seems to me. And again, if you screw up, I think you just apologize. For example, I remember last year, for some reason, I called one of my students Meg Ryan for the entire quarter, who's a Hollywood star. And finally, she said, you know, my name isn't Meg Ryan. And I said, oh, I'm incredibly sorry. And she could tell I really was. So, I mean, obviously, we're human beings and you make mistakes, but then apologize. It's all part of this making the person feel that they're not just another person in your room. They're actually an individual seen as a unique, special person to you. The other thing you want to do is get the students to know you, or you want to get them to know each other. That's the most important thing. And the way I do that the first day is I spend a lot of time doing a getting to know you exercise. And I always say, well, this is kind of stupid, but you know, it really works and it really pays off, and so you know, just bear with me. And what I usually have them do is, if you go around the room and ask 15 adolescents, you know, who are you? Just tell us a little bit about yourself. You're going to get 3 mumbled sentences, right? That's what you're going to get. So what I do is I pair them off, and I pair them off with someone they don't know, and I make them spend 10 minutes with this person introducing each other. And some people take this very seriously. I just love it. They take notes. You know, there's always the kid that takes notes and knows everything about this person and consults the notes and so on and so forth. And other people are more lackadaisical about it. But the idea is that they get to know each other, and then they come back to the class and they introduce each other. So you have something that's cooperative from the very beginning. And it works really well. I find it works really well. One of the things I have them do, actually, is I have them tell an embarrassing story about themselves. You know, within that 10 minutes, you have to tell an embarrassing story within themselves. And I start with my own embarrassing story. And I have a large repertoire to build on, so that's no problem. And once you do that, you have the wonderful experience of a classroom where you're already all laughing together. And that's a wonderful experience to have the first day, where you have the whole class laughing at something together really loud, because some of these stories are absolutely hilarious. Another thing that really works is a getting to know you exercise is tell 3 things about yourself, one of which is a lie. It's really a fun exercise, and the kids have a lot of fun, and then everyone has to guess which one is the lie. And of course it opens up to all kinds of discussions about all 3 things. So all those things work, I think. I've tried all of them and they work pretty well. Again, it takes about an hour, but I think it's worth it. Now, what are you doing while they're introducing each other? You're learning their names. And what I do actually is I do a diagram, which really helps. I'm a spatial learner. And what I do is they introduce each other, and then I'll always have a little conversation with the student. You know, only ask a question. One of the things I'm fascinated with is what states they're from. I love to find out people are from New England, and you know, there's always a little chit chat you can make about that. But you have an individual conversation with each student as they're being introduced, after they've been being introduced. And then comes their favorite part, which is stump the professor, which is when I have to go around the room without the sheet and say all their names. I have to do it right after the introduction exercise, and I have to do it at the end of class. And students love to see you put on the spot. They love to watch you suffer. They just get endless amounts of enjoyment from it. They really do. And I play Stump the Professor 3 times. One after the introductory lecture, one at the end of the class, and the worst one, the beginning of the next class, when they're all in different places. And it's fun. What I usually do is I go and look at the diagram again before class and try and register in my mind what people look like. But all those things I find, learning their names quickly on really makes a huge difference. The other thing you want to do at the first class and every single class after there is get there early. Don't think, you know, students will be, you know, impressed if you rush in at the last minute looking like, my God, you know, I just had a zillion things, you know, I'm somehow fitting you into your schedule, you know. In fact, students like the fact that you have time to spend with them, and you'll find there's a class before the class. If you arrive 10 minutes early, there's usually 4 or 5 of them hanging around. You know, you get to know them, you get to know other parts of the class. The other thing you should do while you're teaching, read the Stanford Daily. you'll be surprised how many of your students will come up. And it gives the students an incredible thrill for you to say, hey, you know, I saw you, won the such and such athletic award last week. That was fantastic. Again, it's the whole person. And if you do it in front of everybody else, it gives that kid recognition. And I've just seen kids shine and grow getting that kind of recognition from you in the classroom. They're blown away that a professor would read the daily and see that they do all kinds of other things. And when you do that, it's a really educational experience. You realize these students, again, this is one slot in their lives. And the fact that they do everything so well is something that you should bring not only to their attention, but to everyone else's as well. Okay, so the first day you've set up the atmosphere. Now you've got about a half an hour left to discuss a book. So how do you start the discussion? That's the next thing. The first thing you don't want to do is start with a canned question. Start with something you think up, on the way to class or something like that. And the most important thing is ask them a question you don't know the answer to. Oftentimes I do something really, really broad, like, what did you think? What did you think of this book? Or for Heart of Darkness today, we did Mill last week. What would Mill think if he read this book? Or, sometimes you can just start with, what did you think? Or did you enjoy reading this book? Or, we had our little, isn't Conrad way over the top conversation at the beginning. And usually some kid, if you just start out with something like that, what did you think? Was it like, I started out today by saying, well, how many of you have read Conrad before? Half the kids. Well, what was it like to reread him? And literally 90% of the time, one of those kids is going to say something fantastic that you can use to build the conversation with. But then it's coming from them. It's not coming from some kind of canned question that you have. So just ask them what they think, something really broad, and then listen carefully and pick up. I mean, today it happened, which was one of the kids said, well, he seems to have a very different vision of society than Mill. I mean, Mill thinks civilization is the fulfillment of human nature, but, Conrad doesn't. That's a great place to start. So that's in one way I start, in a very spontaneous way, in a very general way. What you don't want to do is you don't want to talk yourself. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But the thing you also don't want to do is you don't want them to think that you are setting them up in any way. And if you ask them a question that you already know the answer to, you're going to start getting answers like, well, I don't know if this is what you want, or I don't know if this is what you're looking for. When you get answers like that, you are on the wrong track, because the student has already figured out that you've got an answer that you want from them. And then the game becomes figuring out what the professor wants, which they're really good at, which is why they're at Stanford in the first place. But that's not what you want to play. If you want a true discussion section is not figuring out what the professor wants. So the broader the questions and the questions that you don't know the answers to. That's hard unless you teach books that are new to you, or you teach books like Conrad, which there are questions about that novel I will never figure out. That's what makes it a great book. So it is possible to teach books and that makes it more fun for you. Then the wonder doesn't go out of teaching. Okay, so then getting students to talk, once you've asked that same question. Well, the first thing you could do is coercion. And I love coercion. I use it on every occasion. So I tell them on the first day that they have to talk, and that class participation is 20-25% of the grade. And I tell them this is fair. It's much better for them to be graded on something which happens every week as opposed to something that happens twice a quarter or once a quarter, which is their paper and their exams. I say if you have a bad night the night before, you break up with your girlfriend, your boyfriend, you might not be able to perform well on that exam. This way, a large part of your grade is spread out over 10 weeks. I also tell them it's really hard to get an A in the class unless they talk. I find that threats work very well with these students, but some are very shy. And what do you do with a shy student that never talked? We have email. I'm really thrilled about email as an invention for getting students to talk. And I tell them first day, if you feel like you haven't talked, you haven't done the reading yet, just don't want to talk in front of other students, why don't you give me an email? And I get about 3 or 4 a week from the shy students in this class. And then I answer back, and we have an email conversation. And it's not quite the same as having them to discuss, but it's a realistic goal for a shy student. The other thing I do if a student is shy is I will email them, if I haven't had any communication from them, about 3 weeks into the quarter and tell them to come to my office hours and see me. I'm really concerned that they're not talking. And that actually has turned out to be a really interesting experience. I had one student in the fall who's the president of the ASSU who doesn't talk in class because she's too shy. I mean, I find that really extraordinary. So we ended up having probably what she told me was the most important conversation she'd had with a professor at Stanford, which is about, you know, why is it that she doesn't want to talk in class? So oftentimes there's a story behind shyness that you can work through. So don't just give up on a student if they don't talk. You know, get them into your office, or, you know, maybe it's less threatening, just say, you know, what's going on the email and talk to them that way. But make sure that they know, and again, this goes back to that individuality, inner light issue. Make sure they know that you're aware of them, that you're not just putting them into the scenery in some way. And what I usually do is say, okay, here's a compromise, say one thing in class per week. You know, everyone can say one thing, and then email me, just so I know you're thinking about the books and so on and so forth. So that's how I deal with shy students. Now, most importantly, if you want your students to talk, you have to be quiet. And this seems like it's an incredibly simple thing, but I think it's the hardest thing for professors, which is to shut up. It really is hard. And I have to really struggle. I mean, it's easy for me now because I'm teaching the lecture Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So by the time I get to Thursday, I've pretty much shot my wad after 3 hours. You know, it's somewhat enough. I could still talk another half an hour, but somewhat enough. So it's a little easier. It's much harder in a cloak. And I actually think in a cloak, there's got to be some lecturing done. There's got to be more participation by the faculty. I usually tend to do that at the beginning of the cloak, so that when you do have discussion, you don't intermittently make discussion and lecture. You do lecture, and then you have that moment that's sacred where the students talk. So even in a cloak where there's some discussion of the material, I have to answer questions, I have to lecture, I have to give them background, I have to do the board, I'll do that at the beginning, and then there is the discussion section, but I don't talk during the discussion session. Now, again, it seems like simple. How many times have we gone by classrooms in the corridors of Stanford where you have a group of students sitting around a table and the professor is talking and all the students look incredibly bored? How many times have we seen that? We've all seen that a zillion times. I see it all the time where I live and dwell in this university. Now, students get talked to all day long, and they get talked to all week long. They go to lectures, most of them, and they get talked to for an hour. They get talked to by their parents. They get talked to by pretty much everyone else. So the really unusual experience for them is to sit around and talk to each other. And the only way you can make that happen is if you don't talk yourself. So there are ways to get yourself out of talking. One is, and I really think it's hard to do. I have a hard time too, because I think a student will say something and I'll think, oh, I could say something really good right now. You know, I could really like tie this right up. I know the answer to this. This will sound really good. And I have to literally bite my tongue not to say it, because eventually the students will discover it for themselves. And if you tell a student something, they'll remember it maybe for 3 days. But if the student figures it out themselves, they'll remember it a lot longer. So give that opportunity, give that space for that opportunity to happen. And it's very simple. You might, if you have a hard time with this, you might at least think about a transition phase where the first week, every time you talk, you make a check on your piece of paper, just to make you more aware that you're doing all the talking. And then eventually try and get yourself not to talk. Again, it seems funny that I have to tell this to you, but I think it's really a problem. And I always say to my students, you know, unlike your other lecturers who haven't had a chance to talk all week, I have. And so the first day I say, how much time do you think the professor spends the discussion, a 2-hour discussion session talking? And they all said, oh, about 30 minutes, which is an amazing thing. I said, okay, well, I'll let you out early because I'm not going to talk. And they love that. They just love that. And, you know, also, they pretty much stay to the end because they know they can leave early. Like sometimes they'll leave 5 or 10. And today I had to leave early at 20 of 12 to come here, and literally they groaned. So, so not talking in some way really gives them the space to do it, and they see it as wasted space, a lot of them. They really do. They see it as wasted classroom space. Now, that's not mean I don't say anything at all, because I do say things. But I don't talk in a professorial way. I mostly ask questions. I clarify. I I clarify what's on the board, what's on the table. So there's usually about 3 or 4 things going on. I'll say, okay, we've got 3 things on the table here. We've got, today was like the cannibal issue, the light-darkness issue, the narrator issue, what happens at the end, why doesn't the intended get told, and so on and so forth. So I'll clarify what's going on. And I'll also ask questions which bring the discussion to a higher level. So, sometimes a student will throw something out like, well, yeah, but now the Thames is the heart of darkness. And it's good, but you can take it higher. So I'll say, well, what do you mean by heart? What does that mean? Do you understand what I'm saying? And I explained to them at the beginning, this is really not to put you on the spot, it's just to get the discussion to a higher level. So your role in discussion is to do nothing but ask questions at the right time. Ask the questions that will get the kids to say the things that you want to say at that time, and then clarify what's on the table and bring the discussion to ever higher level. Those are the roles, it seems, for the professor. Not to profess, unless it's a cloak and you do that at the beginning or the end. Okay, now, the last thing that I think professors need to do, besides those 3, clarify the issues, raise the level of discussion to a higher level, question students when they're not clear, or get them to think more in depth about something, is to do what's called a class summary. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in detail, because it's worked a lot. It's really worked really well for me, and I think it's something you might want to try. Now again, my goal is to get the students to talk to each other rather than to figure out what the professor wants or to impress the professor, because they actually have such incredibly smart things to say. That's the amazing thing about Stanford students. They just say incredibly, wonderfully smart things. So they're a pleasure to listen to. So one of the things you can do, you want to get the interaction going this way rather than this way. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is you have 2 or 3 issues on the table. So today, for example, somebody raised this issue of cannibalism. The cannibals in the jungle don't eat the men. So they're showing the kind of restraint that the white Europeans don't really have. Why is that? Why does Conrad put that in? That was one of the issues. And then, people will say, I want to speak to the cannibalism. And I'll say, well, who else wants to speak to this? And then I'll often have the person who originally started it, I'll say, do you want to respond to that? And the kids love that, because they get to come back on the issue and in some way respond to the ways the students have responded to you. So what you want to do is direct cross traffic. Do you want to respond to that? Do you want to get back to that? Do you want to do this? Give kids the chance to talk to each other in a quite directed way. A lot of times when a student's saying something to you, it's really hard because they're looking for your approval. Oh, that was a good point. Yeah, that was great. And I do that a lot, but I also say, that's interesting. What do the rest of you think? So again, I'm not the ultimate arbitrator of the conversation. They are the ones that are really responding to each other. So you have to do that quite actively for about 3 weeks, and then they really get used to talking to each other. Sometimes they pretty much ignore you. And I actually love that. And what I'm doing actually is this class summary, which I'll tell you about. And I actually think this also gets the action interactive rather than all towards the teacher. And it works, I think, particularly well for freshmen and sophomore. But I've used it with upperclassmen, but I think actually freshmen and sophomore like it the most. Now what I do is I make a summary of the discussion. And I'm taking notes during class times. And then I come in, and the first thing I'll talk about in every class is the class summary. I will give it. And this week I'm emailing it to them because they have their midterm exam. So they get a summary of the whole class discussion at the beginning of the next class. And so there are several advantages to this, and I'll tell you what they are. The first is they don't have to write everything down, because you're going to tell them that next week. And so they can really think. That's what one of my students said last week. I love the class summary because all we have to do is think. We don't have to write things down in our notebook, because you're doing that. You're the secretary. The summary provides continuity from week to week. They get a great review of the previous week at the beginning of the next week. And then you can move with the question. So we had just finished my class summary of Mill. So I said well, what do you think Mill would think of Conrad? But they just reviewed Mill, which of course otherwise they probably would have forgotten. It allows you actually to finally put your own little points in, in the class summary. You can kind of fill it out with things that you thought were missing from the discussion, crucial points, oftentimes in a question form. Well, we never really figured out, why blah, blah, blah didn't tell the intended. We never figured that out. Here's my guess, but I'm not sure. You should think about that more. So you can kind of put crucial things in there that you didn't think got around to, which means you don't have to control it as much when it's happening. Another thing, you become the secretary. You are standing outside the discussion as it happens. It sends a signal to the students that the class discussion is about them. It's not about you. You're taking distance from the discussion. You're presenting it as something which they do, not which the teacher does. So just by virtue of how you present and narrate the class, it becomes their class. It's not your class. And lastly, what I do is I really name individual students, because some students have great things to say. And I try and get everybody in with one point if I can, which is hard. And then I also, which works really well, these shy students have emailed me. I will put in, Zainab emailed me this great point about Mill and Nightingale, and I really think we should think about this too. So it brings in the shy students that have emailed you in a way that it otherwise wouldn't. And it brings out their competitiveness, because they all want to get into the class summary, they all want to be the star person who made the crucial point. And they're even looking, to make sure I wrote it down after they say it, They're going, did you get that one, Professor Roberts? It makes them excel, it really does. It makes them, they want to be on television. They want to see it happen. And it also makes them give the message once again that they are individuals in your classroom and that you see them as doing special things and making special contributions. It's that one-on-one special inner light thing that's happening again. So that's sort of my shtick on discussion sections, and I found it worked really well. You might want to try it, the class summary, and then halfway through the class I'll say, what do you think? Does this work? Sometimes it's working really well. They love it. Sometimes it's like, which means it's not working, in which case I stop doing it. And it's mostly juniors and seniors. They seem to like to have, it seems unsophisticated to them in some way. I think it seems too high schooly or something. But freshmen and sophomores, I think it works well with them. Some final problems, and then I'll let you ask questions. Student who talks too much. I've got one in the class today, and doesn't raise his hand. I had to say today, there are a lot of other people who have their hands up. But in general, I will not upbraid or talk seriously to a student in front of others, because it's social humiliation for them. So the better thing to do is just to say to the student, can you stay after for a few minutes and just say, you've got great things to say, but there are a lot of other people who are trying to talk, and I can't let you talk unless you raise your hand. But do that when the student's alone with you in the classroom, because social humiliation is really excruciating for kids this age. Their egos are pretty fragile. And I try and do that kind of thing. And of course, if you socially humiliate a student, it's only a matter of time before they socially humiliate you. It's true. So it's not a game you want to play, because they're so much better at it than we are. Okay, the unreachable student, don't give up. Email the student. If he doesn't answer the email, on his or her papers, write, hey, this is really good. I wish you'd talk in class. You should come and see me. After you write that, follow-up email. Just don't give up on the kid. Even if you can Shanghai the kid in the corridor or as they're leaving the room, try and establish one-on-one contact. One-on-one contact with any student will always make a difference. Always. That's the general rule. Last but not least, strong passions. And this actually brings me back to my Stanford versus Brown. It's a rare moment, I think, and for me anyways, in a Stanford classroom where people get really passionate. And it's a little scary sometimes. I remember in particular walking into a classroom where I had assigned a memoir of a German during the war, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, Berlin Underground, in which she had explained her efforts to shelter German Jews. And within the first 2 seconds, I sort of said, well, what did you think? And the first kid said, this was, crying, tears welling up in her eyes. This book taught me about humanity. And then another student on the other side of the table saying, this was the most immoral book I have ever read, and I am so angry about it, I have to scream. And I was like, oh, it's going to be an interesting section, yes. So that kind of thing, just let it rip. Because it's so rare at Stanford where people get really passionate about it. And as long as the key there is to just respect everyone's opinions and to make sure everyone gets heard. And to check back with people. Well, what do you think about that? How would you respond to that? That sort of let people talk and express their emotions. Another thing is, I had another wonderful moment in the classroom where I had taught about 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's a sort of triumphant moment. And I had a student from Romania who's since become a cherished student who I have lunch with a lot. And she just got up and said, you talked in class about what a great moment in 1989 was. Well, I was in Romania, and I have something different to tell you. And then she spent 10 minutes talking about the Romanian Revolution, and her mother was a doctor in the hospital, and she had a very different story to tell, and it was very threatening to me. She basically undermined everything I'd said in lecture. But for the students, it was a real moment, and it was a moment where they really saw someone who lived through something historical, as opposed to, Professor Roberts talking about it on the stage. So I just was silent. I just let it happen, and it turned out to be a great moment for her, too, to be able to talk about it. So I think those moments are rare at Stanford, and they're really precious, and you just have to let them happen and fasten your seatbelt and ride them out. And again, as I say, there is nothing like the high I get from coming out of a class that has gone really well. It's really one of the great passions of my life. So I hope it happens to you, too. Thanks. And I hope there are questions. I think you have to deploy more stringent police tactics in moments like that. I would still go with the take the student aside. Still tell the student, instead of saying you're asking interesting questions, I'd say you're asking valid questions, or you have a right to answer these questions. Something that's a little more honest, right, but doesn't give him the signal or her the signal that she's doing something that she isn't. And so you really need to be careful not to do that, because it's not fair to the other students. Again, you always couch it in, it's not because I don't like it, it's because it's not fair to the other students. And then if he or she continues to do that, then you do have to police them in front of the other students, I think. But you've at least given that kid an out before humiliating him. So I do rather passive-aggressive things. I had a student last year who just talk, and talk and talk and talk. We've all had that, like they start out and they have some germ of something, but then they quickly, dissolve into, dribble. And, after like about 2 minutes, the other students would, like this, and I go, okay, that's great. It was passive aggressive, but there's no other way to stop a student like that, just say, or you start summarizing. Oh, so you're saying blah, blah, blah. Okay, what do you think? And then just move on. You just got to do it. But I had talked to that student before and said, there are many students in this class, you seem to talk for a long time. I think it'd be really good exercise intellectually for you to figure out what you want to say and say it in a succinct manner. And then after he didn't do that, then it seems to me you can move into social humiliation ground. But the interesting thing about students like that, they don't seem to notice. So it's not like you're hurting anyone's feelings. I mean, if they had social sensitivity, they wouldn't be doing it in the first place. So, okay. I actually think it's never going to be a smooth transition. There's always that moment, and actually this raises something really important. There's always that moment when you ask the question and it's silent. But those kids are trying to move. They're trying to get their book out. They're trying to, think about what they're saying. Most important thing, again, is shut up. Sit on that silence. It's the hardest thing to do in teaching. I have sat on silences 3 and 4 minutes long, and eventually someone will talk. But that's a common problem with beginning teachers. They freak out when it's quiet and start to talk. So sit on the silences in that awkward transition. I think it helps actually to do the class summary right before the discussion, because it gets them into thinking about the discussion they last had. So that's the thing I do. So I'll start out by announcements, then any kind of background they may need, then class summary, getting the thinking in the discussion mode, then the discussion, and then at the end of class I usually give questions for next week, reading questions, so they're looking beyond. So that's the best you can do. But there is that awkward moment when you start a discussion where they're kind of having to move into a new mode when they have to think, as opposed to just listening to you. And so you need to sit on the silence in those moments. Of course, I love that. From the professor's perspective, great, what's the problem with that? No, I mean, obviously you want them to think for themselves. What I would say is, depending on, again, the risk of social humiliation, how much you know this kid, you might say, either take him aside or her aside, or say in class, well, that's what Professor blah, blah, blah thinks. What do you think? And just sit on the silence, and do that, a couple times. Or take the kid aside and say, you are really listening in lecture, but I really want to know what you think, not what Professor blah, blah, blah thinks. So what do you think? And if the kid's silent, sit on that silence, because that kid's probably never had to think for him or herself before, and it takes a while to kind of get over the shock of that. So, yeah. I find that, some kind of policing tactics usually have to be, it depends on, if it's consistent, then you might want to take the person aside after it happens a couple times, but one of the things you always want to do, and this is why I talked about passions at the very end, those passionate moments, is you want to protect everyone's feelings in the class. And I have had moments where, people have said things that are really offensive to other students, and it's really good to watch them work it out, and I find that they do most of the time. I'm ready to stand there and, tell this kid he said something offensive and to protect this kid, but actually, if you can, just hold on to that excruciating moment and watch them work it out themselves. They usually do. That's my experience anyways, The first class I taught at Stanford was Women in Gender in Modern France, and it was, of course, like 8 women and 1 man. And I love this guy, but the first 3 weeks he said about 16 offensive things. And the women were incredibly cool about it and just sort of educated them, And, it was fine. It worked out. So, but he wasn't hostile at all. He was just ignorant and needed to be educated. So, hostility is different, and again, again, this is the thing, it's an art. I can't give you any guidelines here. It depends on how the temper is of the room. If this guy is really hostile, you've got to protect your kids, but there's nothing more important than giving kids the chance to protect themselves. Yeah. I teach History 3, which has always been about 300 kids. This year it's a little smaller. And so then I teach a section off of that. So there's no way I'm going to get to know all 200 kids' names. This is impossible. But what I do is I have lunches, pizza lunches. I have a pizza lunch, a burrito lunch, another pizza lunch, whatever. So every day I'm getting up and saying, there's this lunch. All you have to do is email me, come and meet me, And I actually bring my dog. Because a lot of them freshmen really miss their dogs at home, and it seems to be a big thing. Dogs are always real social bonders. So I try to get to know them one-on-one in other ways, but I don't try and learn all their names. Yeah. That's a good question. I should have covered that more. In fact, I go in with about 4 things I really want to have come out. For every reading. For Conrad, I could just name off 4 things. And that's why the class summary works, because usually they'll come out. Because everyone knows there's 4 things to talk about in pretty much every book. But if they don't, then when you do the class summary the next week, you can bring in that last point. So I do go with 4 things. It's kind of like knowing where your destination is, but letting the path itself form itself spontaneously. Because if you go in, let's say heart, what is the heart of darkness? If I asked that today, they all would have went, I know that would have been the response. So you can't get to the destination that you want through canned questions. You have to go in and let it happen and hope that those 3 or 4 things come out. And if they don't, figure out, I mean, another thing teachers do, which I think is really legitimate, is have the last word, you know, and kind of wrap things up together and give closure. I think that works for a lot of people, and that's another time in which you can talk about it. But yeah, you should definitely go in there with 4 things you want to talk about. Thanks. Yeah. Well, again, it depends on the thing. Like sometimes it's a matter of interpretation, and then you can say, well, you know, that's really an interesting interpretation. It's different from mine, but it's completely valid. But with the Romania incident, she was right. You know, I painted too rosy a picture of the Eastern European moment there in 1989, and so I just said, I'm really glad you're in my class because you really taught me that, and I'm going to, you know, next year when I lecture, I'm going to do it differently. And that's a painful moment for a teacher, but it's a really good moment. And you have to think beyond your own humiliation in those moments and think this is a good educational moment. So for something which is factual or something that's not purely interpretive like that, I will admit that I was wrong. But I mean, there are so many ways to look, like something about my historical narrative or a way a novel is, you know. Like if I come out, comrades are racist, and somebody says no, then it's a matter of interpretation. You can recognize the validity of the interpretation without taking back your own view. So again, it just depends on the circumstances. Yeah. I actually think there are advantages and disadvantages of becoming more old and established, because if you think in familial terms, when I first got to Stanford, I was the older sister. But now I'm entering into that highly problematic, sticky, dangerous territory, which is I am the mother. And I really have seen a difference in how students react to me. And I'm looking forward to that moment where I cross the threshold to the grandmother, because I actually think the grandmother is a much less, you know, sort of pathetically complicated role. And so the older sister is like you're the cool older sister who knows all the cool stuff, you know? And that actually happened when I was more in high school, when I was in my 20s. I was the cool older sister, and everyone was like, you know, they come and like touch what I wear, you know? And then I was sort of like the really cool upper sister, you know, maybe a little older than a sister in my 30s. And I think that was when I had no problems teaching. That was just you know, because I didn't have to establish my authority, but at the same time, I was not in the mother category. And now I'm, you know, in my 40s, I am squarely in the mother category. And I can tell that it makes it much harder for me to talk to them and for them to be really comfortable telling me what they really think. Because it's complicated for them. I'm a woman of a certain age, which is the same age as their mothers, and I think they're dealing with all that stuff all the time. And I do think once you get older, you become, I mean, I think the grandmother, grandfather thing, I'm looking forward to it because I think it's less complicated. You become the wise elder. But I think all those things affect you. And I mean, the way I respond to it is, as an older sister, I dressed in a way that gave me more authority. I wore, you know, heels. And I was a little bit more distant. And now as a mother, I don't try to tell them to do anything. It seems to really work, you know, just, you can think what you want, you know. I just lay off of them in that way. I don't in any way tell them any one thing that they absolutely have to do, except for things that they need to get a grade. You know, I don't give them a lot of advice about how to study, for example. You know what I mean? I sort of lay off on the advice thing, and that seems to get them out of the parent-child relationship. So that's the best I can do. Yeah. No, I actually wouldn't. I think I would think about 5 things that I wanted them to know about the paper. I would hope it would come out in discussion. And then if it doesn't, I would do it at the beginning of the next class in the class summary, as I said, so that they have every opportunity of figuring out, because again, it's the old Socratic method. If a student figures it out themselves, they will remember it much longer. If you give them 5 things to remember on a piece of paper, they won't remember it for very long. And they don't have the pleasure of discovering it, which is, as we know, the real pleasure of learning. actually, if you're having troubles with that, again, a kind of nice coercive measure that, that seems to work is to have them write a 2 or 3 page reaction paper before class. And they have to give it to you at class time. It represents more work for you, because then you have to correct a paper every week, but it does get them to do the reading. So that's what I would do. And I don't tend to do that unless I have to, just because it's more work. I mean, I actually think it's a great idea if you want to do it, because it does get them to crystallize their thoughts about the book. They have to go back over it after having read it. But it's a lot of work, so, yeah. Well, the first thing I do is I tell them that I want them all to get an A, and that I'm not the type of teacher who you know, thinks I'm smart if I only give 1 A. And so I tell them, first off, I really want you all to get A's. I told them that today because their midterm exam is on Monday. And then I grade them in a way one would normally grade. You know, I used to say, well, how do I grade? If it interests me, it's an A. If it bores me, it's a B. And if it pisses me off, it's a C. That was my old scale. Which means at Stanford, if it interests me, it's an A. If it bores me, it's an A minus. And if it pisses me off, it's a B plus. But that's kind of how I grade, I have to say. You know, if it's really good, it's an A. If it's, you know, done the work, it's a B plus, A minus. And if it's really not good, it's below that. I don't know if that's the question you wanted me to answer, but.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.